Mittal here, live in the sunroom, and all of you people online. Today I'm going to talk about modern chess preparation, and it's actually much different than it used to be because it ain't as straightforward as it was in the 80s, even the 90s, where everyone just tried to follow the narrow path because everybody really believed that there is one solution in chess, when it turns out to be the same way as Rome was. There are just multiple ways, but they all lead to Rome. Same thing in chess. So I want to start off with this game from the Turkish league. Tabatabaei plays Aditya Mittal. And what's going to be interesting is the method how White conducts himself and the way he plays the opening. So e4, nothing too spectacular about this. Fischer's favorite, which still pretty popular, although d4 had a resurgence and c4 was very popular. In fact, c4 was a Yasser special. In fact, beat Korchnoi with it. But back to our game, e4, c5, knight f3, e6, and previously and in the past, everybody really played d4 takes. And, well, there's a lot of moves here that Black can do. Black can play the Taimanov, named after the legendary pianist, Mark Taimanov, also a wonderful chess player. And also there is the Scheveningen, the classical Scheveningen, and this has been essayed by none other than Kasparov in his match versus Karpov in the 80s. Now this sort of have fallen out of fashion. Instead, this had again a resurgence of a sort. And well, some people go knight b5, but this four knights variation has been very popular. We're not going to get into the nitty gritty. And Tabatabaei actually goes into some sort of a sideline, goes for pawn to g3. You have to mention pawn to c3 here. This is a direct transposition back to the Alapin variation. So g3, and this is sort of the new wave. It sort of started a little bit with Anand and continued with Carlsen. White doesn't really want to fight, or actually postpones the fight and steers the game towards the middle game. So knight c6, bishop g2, knight f6. And here I do want to ask you, what would you play in this position? Of course, it's very early in the middle game, but here every decision you make is going to have a profound influence on the character of the game, especially as the position is still so fluid. And of course, Black is trying to pick up the pawn on e4. How would you guys go about that? How would you do? Push the pawn? Okay. So one thing with this pawn push is actually not good right now. It is very tempting, but always remember, chess is like a soccer field. Once you get into your opponent's territory, that would be a big advantage. So this is either really good or not so good. Here is the latter, because knight g4, and if d4, there's a pawn capture and the pawn falls. And if queen e2, Black is just in time to corral the pawn. So you don't really have enough time to hold on to it. If you could hold on to it, you would get the advantage.
So knight to c3?
Knight c3? So you don't have to push it immediately. You can do it later.
No,
If,
I mean, like e6 is what I would, because I feel like knight c3. I mean, is it e3?
c3, c3.
D3?
D3. Yeah,
d3,
because I feel like you always want to have that c3 push and your knight on c3 will block it. So d3 is probably the better way to go.
But I do want to hear why you want to go knight c3.
Well, it bishop
Mhm.
protects the pawn.
Okay, so let's say I just defend against this. How would you continue?
Yes. Okay.
So yeah, sure, you can castle.
Yeah.
So you may wait about, or what? Hmm?
D4 then?
D4? Okay. So you would transpose eventually to sort of a Scheveningen with a G2 bishop, which of course was a little bit underestimated previously, but is actually kind of dangerous for black because this bishop puts and mounts some pressure while that bishop on C8 is a little bit passive. Now, of course, that's a simplistic way of talking about the position, but there is some play for white. So, of course, you can go knight c3, you can go d3, but the key is you have to know what you want to achieve. And that was actually a very good explanation. Well, if you do go knight c3, you ought to go for the d4 break. And that's one of those things that people actually misevaluate. They make a move, but they don't have a long-term plan already built in. So if you do go knight c3, you have to go for d4. Now in this game, Tabatabaei goes d3, going for the classical Fischer King's Indian attack style. Now it's not going to be exactly like that, as you'll see. So d5, queen e2. Already a deviation from the classical Fischer way. Fischer always played it with knight to bd2, bishop e7, castles, castles, and rook e1. This is, of course, the classical King's Indian attack, but this is sort of outside the scope of this lecture. White goes queen e2, and queen e2 actually has its ups and downs. The upside of queen e2 is that this bishop is not buried by the knight on d2. That's a positive. Also, with the queen already on e2, you don't have to worry about these trades. Those are not possible. But there is a drawback of queen e2. So we already talked about the positives, but can you spot a potential negative of having the queen on e2 instead of d1? And don't be shy. What you find troubling might be the answer. Chesslover has a great point. b6, bishop a6 often is an issue because, in this case, d takes e4 becomes a threat because not only does this bishop x-ray the queen, it also x-rays the queen, and the rook, that is. So b6, bishop a6 is one of those issues. What could be another issue that white has to be mindful of?
Well, not right away, but knight to d4 is kind of looming.
Yes. So knight d4 is sort of looming. Right now, we have that covered because we have knight takes d4 in this position. So that's not a big problem yet, but you always have to look out for that idea. So bishop e7 was played, a4, and a4 is sort of the sign of the times. And I have to go back to make sense of this a4 move. So apologies. Bishop e7, castle, castle, rook e1, and pawn to b5 is the main line of the Fischer attack / King's Indian attack. The idea of that, you're going with b4 and a5, and you are rolling down the board, while white is, of course, trying to checkmate you with h4, h5, and h6. And, of course, these positions are very complicated, and it is very rich in ideas. So if you haven't tried it out yet, you should take a chance at it, because if you become really good, you may win a lot of games with this specific line. So d5, queen e2, bishop e7, a4, And you can sort of see that they're still playing the old main lines, but they actually add an extra wrinkle, making it a little bit original and just a little bit differing from the usual path, which gives them the psychological advantage, which is very important in modern chess, to actually be in the know while your opponent is sort of grasping at straws, trying to figure out if this is the same thing, I could do the same stuff, or I have to do something else. So this actually becomes some of a jazzy chess for black, because they're not exactly sure what they're supposed to do, so they're going to freestyle, most likely. So a4, castle, castle. So this is your chance to freestyle. How would you freestyle here for black? And then we'll take a look of what black does in the game.
Wait, so what do you mean by freestyle?
Freestyling is that he already does not know theory. So he's not going on autopilot. It's not home preparation. So he has to go with her gut feeling. And that's actually something very important to build up, because eventually, even if you know reams and reams of theory, you will have to rely on yourself.
I would trade on E4.
Okay, they take back.
And then play E5.
Okay, very good. That's one very typical way of playing.
I'm
How?
looking to get the bishop out, so
Mhm.
to B6.
Mhm. And one of those things about knowing classical games and knowing typical plans, and that's why it's so important, because once you know, hey, this is a typical idea, it may actually fit the bill in the variation we're looking at. And B6 doesn't really hit me as by any ways inferior to D takes E4. And it's super logical, you want to get your bishop in the game. Now, E5 could seem interesting. The only problem there is that the E5 pawn compared to a King's Indian, which is this position reversed, the pawn is going to fall. So you take, I take here, and you're down a pawn, I just take everything and will be in cruise control. Queen takes d5 is also not that great because you would lose time. And the knight actually wins a tempo on the queen, and white should be a little bit better, although it's still going to be a game. So d takes e4 was played. Maybe another move that might be worth a mention is d4. You could kind of claim that white actually played more useful moves and up a couple of tempi compared to a King's Indian. But it's still a King's Indian, and in that case, once black gets the e5 pawn in, black is going to have the center control and more space. I mentioned earlier, you manage to get a striker into your opponent's field, and it actually matters quite a bunch in chess because it clamps down on white's position. So in some sense, black could justify playing this way, although white can still claim that I do have some extra moves in. Why wouldn't this be okay for me?
Who has the extra moves? The
White side.
Yeah.
So let me go back just to pinpoint that. So this is a typical King's Indian. And black would already have these moves in. That's the difference. That white is playing a King's Indian reversed, but up a knight a6 move, up a queen e7 move, and these extra tempi do matter a lot. Now, it doesn't mean that black is better. It means that it's a fight. And white could also be just better because of space. Like, space should never be underestimated. Sometimes, and most of the time, overestimated, but space is space. It still counts for something. But back to our regular programming. D takes, e5. Now d takes, e5 is a very logical way of playing. And on pure terms, we could kind of argue that black equalized because it's one-on-one pawns in the center. However, strategically, this choice by black is quite risky. Can you spot why this idea of d takes is risky for black, especially after this pawn push of e5?
But you have rook to d1 right away.
Rook to d1.
Rook d1, I move my queen.
Yeah, he will move queen and protect the pawn. I think because the whole purpose in this is to put your knight on e4, and if the white plays c3, then now you just got two vulnerable pawns.
So one of the tricky things about the King's Indian attack and / King's Indian is that it's more strategic than it looks. It looks like black just goes caveman style, or white goes caveman style if we're looking the King's Indian attack. But once black here makes a strategic mistake, you have to pinpoint it and realize where the target lies. So you got a pawn in e4, black has a pawn on e5. What else is up for grabs? Well, it's d4 and d5, right?
Yeah.
So the big question here is not enough to occupy a square for yourself. What's even more important is to deny your opponent the same thing. So how can we deny our opponent some crucial squares in this position? C3, of course. And I'm going to give an example for why rook d1 isn't necessarily perfect if we're just straight up going for d5. Now, there's nothing wrong with rook d1, and there's nothing wrong with trying to occupy the square, but this is the kicker. Black gets to put the knight on d4 because we denied ourselves the c3 push. Takes, we capture back how? C-pawn, obviously. So you usually don't want to capture away from the center. You want to take towards the center. The c-pawn is a peripheral pawn. It's not quite in the center. Now it's a center pawn. You get the knight to d5. I take, pawn takes, and it's actually a position with both sides actually getting some control. Black gets the control on d4 and e5, and white gets a pawn on d5. And by pure math, this actually means who's up? Just by pure math, you can tell who's better.
Materially it's equal.
Yeah, but who controls more squares in the center?
Black.
Black. So black actually gets to control two very important squares, and this pawn on d5 is somewhat isolated. Now, of course, it can be a thorn in the side and can become an aggressive passer and a strong passer, but for now, it's blockaded and it's unlikely to move forward successfully. So therefore, it's important to go c3. Deny your opponent the try of knight to d4, and then come up with a plan to somehow get close to that d5 square. So how could we potentially get to that d5 square? Now, you don't have to rush to go there. First of all, you should try to improve your pieces. How can white improve his pieces?
Knight to a3, c2, e3, and then d5.
So knight a3, knight c2, knight. So this is the long Lord of the Rings route.
Okay, I was wondering. I'm like, what did you just say?
That's a typical King's Indian.
Yeah, so one of the things though is that just because it's the King's Indian you don't necessarily have to copy that play. You can do better. It's not a bad idea, but it's a little bit too on the nose. So in the sense that knight a3, you actually have a better spot, better square than c2. That this knight would gladly occupy.
C4.
And that's actually very important. Don't immediately go for a long howl plan. Try to put your piece on a good spot and see how well it functions there.
Okay, so you're saying knight to a3 and then c4?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah.
So, no, there's nothing wrong with knight c2, but I would prefer, and in fact was played in the game, to put your knight on a good spot, see how it does, and then see if you can get to d5.
No, that makes sense.
So queen c7, knight a3, rook d8, knight c4. Here we go. Also, this square is a classic outpost. Good old outpost, because we stabilize with this a4 pawn move. Yeah, and Yelub is correct. I do want to do this tricky idea. So this is the tricky idea. I mean, what Peter wanted. And if knight e4, there's this knight d5 trick. I hit on the queen, I hit on the knight. Something falls. So rook d8, knight c4, pawn to b6, b3, bishop a6. So both players are grandmasters, by the way, and it kind of shows because black hits on a nice plan of putting pressure on our knight. White goes queen c2, bishop takes, pawn takes, knight a5. So black decides to give up the bishop for a doubled pawn. Is that a good deal?
Not in this play.
You don't think so?
Because his dark square bishop can't get into the game. So his light square bishop was actually a good.
Yeah, this dark squared bishop is not that good. It's still fairly useful because it defends the black king in some cases, as you'll see. However, he did give up his better piece. And that's one of those things that you really have to stick to. If you have a good piece, try to be stingy with that. Don't trade it. Don't trade it off the first time you get the chance. But here, actually, white comes up with a beautiful little idea. Goes knight h4. And it's all built on the fact that he's got the bishop pair, and the only thing that would set some problems for white is time. Because with time, this pawn on c4 would become a weakness. But what white is arguing, well, I'm just going to go all out attacking you. And that's just going to lead to success. So g6, f4, knight h5, and here white comes up with a brilliant move. It's absolutely brilliant and completely in the spirit of Michal Tal.
Now, before we get there,
Yeah.
why did black play g6 instead of just taking the pawn?
So black probably considered taking and chose not to take the pawn because that does give you the chance to get the knight to f5. Now this bishop, even though is passive and seemingly not so useful, if you would move it away, I immediately can pounce and pin your knight. And I can also start rolling with f4. So, yeah?
Instead of moving the bishop back, if you just go g6,
If you do that, I do capture.
I lose a good knight for a bad bishop.
Well, yes, but these are trades. And you're trying to improve the position. And the whole point is that black will have so many holes to work with that white will have very good play and straightforward play after rook e1 and f4. So And that's actually the paradoxical thing about chess, is that even though you consider a piece passive, it may still be very useful in defense. And especially if you go g6, you are actually weakening the squares that your bishop is supposed to defend. So it indeed is a classical positional pawn sacrifice. However, here it's going to be a classical Tal sacrifice, which I wouldn't necessarily consider positional, but in some sense it kind of is too.
So if it's Tal, he will play knight to f6. Is that f5?
I capture.
Yeah, there. That seemed like a Tal move. Or do you just push f5?
So the first key thing in chess is your opponent. Black just played knight f6 to knight to h5. Of course, I gave a hint of what may happen, but what's more important is understanding why knight h5 happened in the first place.
I have no idea why he played knight h5. Does he want to trade the bishop for the knight?
So a little bit this, but also there's some pressure on the f-pawn. So, and it's sort of a combination of the two. You are threatening the knight on the side, but you also try to win a pawn if possible. Why don't they just memorize good moves? Because every position is a new position. Like, you can't just memorize everything. Eventually, you'll have to make good decisions, and that's the skill that you need.
Well, I'm looking at f times e5.
You could take, but I do capture back.
But there's a long-term.
Or I could even consider taking. If you have the capacity to memorize positions, then go for it, like tons and tons of. So one of the things that I think is bad in current modern chess is people try to ruin the game for themselves. There's not much fun memorizing the game. You can just do that and study history. This is the same thing. Like, there's not a lot to see there. The goal of the game is to be a good problem solver, to hone your skills, to understand the psyche of your opponent, how he, she is thinking. That's what chess is about. And that's actually the skills that you can learn from chess and bring it to other places of life. If you just memorize it, there's no point doing that. You can also memorize all the flags. It doesn't make you a better person. But you'll know all the flags. So there's an upside.
Well, the reason I was talking about taking the f to the e5 pawn is that you're opening that file, and the queen's going to come over to f2 eventually. I mean,
there is an upside. However, your structure gets a little bit messed up. And also, it's not Tal-like.
Yeah.
We need Tal-like behavior here.
If we do Tal wouldn't Tal play knight to f5?
Knight f5, of course. Tal-like behavior. Now, when I'm saying Tal-like behavior, I'm actually referring to a game Botvinnik Tal, where he actually essays a very similar sacrifice, where he crushed Botvinnik in the World Championship match. Pawn takes, and this sacrifice is more of the shocking kind. There are sacrifices that are logical and you say, well, I can clearly see how this is going to succeed. Now, what do you think? What could be the idea behind this sacrifice, which I agree does feel in some sense more of a positional sacrifice than a tactical one? Not to say that tactics aren't involved.
We talking, you said what's the idea of it?
Yeah, what could be the strategic idea? What do you think could be the strategic idea of this sacrifice?
The bishop out. The bishop on the long diagonal is now open.
I'm listening,
You
yeah?
want E5.
Just a second, yeah.
You can push your G and H pawns and
Yes, you may start rolling your G and F pawns eventually.
Can you get bishop to E5? Like that bishop is long.
What happened to the bishops with this knight F5 sacrifice?
They get
Davanchi, what do you think? What improved in this position for white?
I think not just like the opening, but also getting more lines to attack towards the king.
So you said opening of the bishop, which is very important. Most of these structures, this bishop is a lame duck on G2. It actually is becoming a monster. But can you kind of expand and talk a little bit more of the weaknesses around the king? What are sort of weak in black's position? Yeah.
Like generally there's like this H6 F8 thing which the dark square bishop can potentially grab.
Mm-hmm.
And then light square wise there's always the bishop D5 hitting the diagonal on F7.
Very good. Yes, the bishop D5 move is hanging
While
there.
the queen comes over, there's like the H8 and F8 squares too.
Mm-hmm. So what if knight takes c4? Of course, knight takes c4 is wrong for many reasons, but there's a key reason why it's not so good. You know, you don't have to feel that this is a pop quiz, but I'm going to call on the back because you guys are very quiet. So the thing with knights is that they're actually very loose. They're on the sides of the board. How can you connect them?
Oh,
Queen.
Yeah,
Queen to
yeah.
E2.
I want to hear some words from the back.
Okay.
Queen D2.
Queen e2. Very nice.
See, I had that.
You guys had it. And that's the thing. That's why this sacrifice is so beautiful and so outstanding, because Tabatabaei realized that, oh, your knights are just so bad. If I open up the position, I will get a chance to attack them and go after them.
See, and I actually liked that knight captured on C4 just because I was looking at preventing the bishop from getting the D6. But I did not realize how vulnerable the knights was. That would have missed that.
So they're saying that some guy was a time traveler and knew that this was a brilliant game. Very well done by that guy. Now, the thing is, this knight is going to be in constant trouble. We also threatened to take that, but this bishop is actually becoming quite good. So knight takes c4 wasn't played. It was rook c8. Queen e2. Knight takes f4. And black sort of gives back the knight and saying, okay, I want to stabilize. So g takes, bishop f6.
Can you say why knight to F6 was not good?
So knight f6 runs into what?
Oh, knight
People.
Take the pawn. Yeah.
You take the pawn and the pawns start rolling. Yes. And it just shows that, yes, this idea by Tabatabaei is sound. So here, knight takes, g takes, bishop f6. How should we roll the attack? Devanshi,
Yeah.
go ahead. What should you do here as white?
Okay, I think this might be maybe crazy or something, but I was thinking h4, and after bishop takes, I go f6. The bishop takes.
H4.
And then after bishop takes, I go f5, and then suddenly the bishop can go to h6.
Very creative. H4 is very creative. The only problem with this, like what she said, was H4 here takes, and giving up pawns to open up the positions, and your concept is great. It's a great concept. The only issue here is that they're not forced to take it.
Right.
Plus, when they lose their bishop anyway after queen check.
Yeah. So anytime you get a position like this, you still want to control the key squares. Key squares, back there. What type of key square can we control? Yes? D5. Exactly what was played a move later. He probably didn't want to go immediately because he was afraid of knight b3 double attack, so he avoids that. Bishop d5, e takes, queen h5, bishop e5. Now I know, there's just way too many brilliancies in this game, so just bear with me. Bear with me. It's just too good. But this move is really, really, really beautiful. And again, one of the key things in chess is the pair of bishops. And this move actually just emphasizes it even more. And it's probably just as brilliant as knight to f5, if not more brilliant.
If I may.
Yeah.
Rook takes f4.
Uh-huh.
Bishop takes.
Boom. Yep.
And
Yep.
Yeah, and then let me see which one's the right way to go. Bishop takes f7. Queen takes f7, king h8. Queen takes f7, check, king h8, and queen f6.
Of course. Well said. Beautifully done. And she's got it. Rook takes f4 is the move. And one of the things that you gotta remember, the bishop pair can be monstrous when unopposed, and this knight practically is just an onlooker. It really doesn't do anything, and it's completely sidelined. So, there always should be a warning sign whenever you put the knight on the rim. So it gets quite dim over there. So rook f4, king h8, rook h4. Black decides to avoid that because he would just get checkmated. f6, bishop h6, and you can already see the dark clouds over black's position. Rook e7 here takes, bishop d4, and what white does is still very good in this position, but here this probably could have been the cherry on top if he finds this move. So I am actually going to spoil it. I'm so sorry, but it's beautiful. Now, if you don't want to get spoiled, you may pause it and try to solve it yourself. But this is magnificent. The move that white should have played is queen to g6. You guessed it?
Yes.
Wow. So what if I capture?
Yeah.
Bishop to f8.
f8, but then rook h7.
Yeah, if bishop f8, I still have time to get my rook over to h7.
Bishop g7, king takes, rook takes g6.
Go ahead.
Bishop g7.
Bishop g7 check.
King takes.
It's a double check. You're forced to move.
Yeah, the main thing is the rook should not
Check.
come to h7. We block
Yes.
the king, and then rook h8.
Yeah, because the bishop.
Oh, that's beautiful.
It is beautiful, right?
Crazy.
Is that the only winning move that you have to find that queen move?
So no, this is obviously the easier thing to find. I'm not knocking on you here because you'll see the difficult one. So bishop takes, queen takes, rook g7, and the upside of doing a lot of puzzles and learning from classic tactics books is that you learn checkmates you've never seen before. And ladies and gentlemen, you're going to learn something new tonight. White actually has a brilliant move setting up checkmate, and there is no defense.
So bishop takes rook.
If bishop takes, I do capture back.
Yeah, but then the rook takes the pawn.
So you take,
Okay.
take here. My queen will still try to block you.
Bishop to F5.
4.
4, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Move here.
Oh, well, now the rook can take the pawn.
Takes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because the queen comes over.
Mate.
Ah.
Now, bishop f4 is great. It turns out the computer wants the more sadistic bishop to d2, and there's no way to stop. Now, bishop f4, I do believe, is good as well. But bishop d2, same idea, rook h7, queen h6, checkmate. You can't do anything without just losing the whole house and everything.
It's looking at the onlooker.
It is looking at that fella on a5. Now, it didn't happen, but white actually is still mopping up. Rook takes, getting rid of a good piece. So, and I'm actually not critical that rook takes d4. And that's one thing that you should remember. Either you see a way to just win the game cleanly after the right move, like the long sequence of a tactic, or just go for something where you're sure that you're gonna just clinch victory. So here rook takes d4 eliminates black's only good piece, therefore guaranteeing if anyone wins, it's going to be white. So even though not objectively the ultimate best, but a very good practical decision. Queen g4 takes, and this, of course, does not take a lot of effort from white. The king is just too exposed. Check. Checks again. You can't go here because of rook e7. Here takes. Queen e5, king b7. Check. So if you're up material, trade. Also, you have a very strong f-pawn to work with. Takes. Rook e6, denying squares. So again, a couple of tidbits. Always look at the intentions of your opponent. Look where they're aiming to go. Try to stop them. As Julian correctly pointed out earlier, if you weren't here, where have you been? Never miss a Julian lecture. How dare you? So here, f6, rook e7, bishop e5, and last but not least, who you should bring to the party? The king. And here, black gave up. The bishop is very, very, very strong. Even if the pawn starts running, the bishop will be there to stop it. King gets to the center.
The
And
onlooker got active too late.
yeah, the knight got
Because he can capture it.
got kind of trapped.
Yeah.
So it got better, but it also got much worse. So last but not least, I do want to show a game by none other than Fabiano Caruana against Deac Bogdan. So one thing that you may see behind me, Rapid and Blitz will be around the corner, and I will do live commentary with special guests, maybe Fabi, maybe Hikaru. You gotta come and see. So I will do live commentary for the Rapid and Blitz over here in the sunroom. So you are more than welcome to join, and hope to get them guests from the tournament. Now, we are featuring Fabi here because Fabi, of course, is known to be a big guy when it comes to home preparation. Now, there's two ways of preparing. You can go straight up to the main line, or you can try to tweak it. And that's what Fabi did this game against Deac Bogdan. So let's get into it. So d4, c4, knight c3, bishop b4. Now I do have to mention, because this is an interesting thing, e3 was suggested by the Romanian kickboxer Murazanu, who is actually a personal favorite of mine. I actually saw him do kickboxing, and also a big chess fan. This game was played in Romania, Bucharest. So d4, c4, bishop b4, e3, a3, and we sort of transpose back to the Saemisch. c5, bishop d3, knight c6, and this has been very topical for a long time, and in fact featured in an important match between Yusupov and Karpov. That followed knight e2, b6, castles, bishop a6, e4, knight e8. The idea here, which might look weird at first sight, is that black wants to be able to block white's attack. So f4 and then f5, and that's sort of the key. After knight g3, black can actually build a wall of pawns which white can't really breach through, and this has been actually very popular in practice with very solid results by black. So it is considered somewhat harmless, although there is still a couple of games that have been played of recent, but it more or less is considered fine for black. However, here comes Fabiano's twist, rook b1, which is actually built on a fantastic South American player's idea. His name is Peralta. He came up with this idea of rook b1, and Fabi thought it worthwhile to follow his footsteps. So rook b1, and the whole point is if black goes b6, e4, knight e8, white actually can do something else that he didn't have a chance to do in the previous line. So in the previous case, as I may remind you, white played knight e2. I wonder if you could figure out what white intends to play here instead.
G4.
Well, g4 looks very aggressive, but you don't really have a target, so you're not really attacking the knight. Otherwise, g4 doesn't really have a purpose. So it's nothing outlandish. In fact, it's a fairly normal move. No, queen move would be a little bit too aggressive for now.
Is this for white we're doing?
White, yes. It's a normal developing move. Of course. Knight f3. And the whole point is, white was sort of waiting a little bit till black commits to b6, and then instead of having the knight on e2, decides to get the knight on f3.
Why?
I'm going to explain right now why. So bishop a6, then white actually ventures to push the pawn on e5. Now there is, of course, a lot of strategical shuffling going on. White gets the bishop pair, but is saddened and saddled with these pawns on c4 and c3. In the long run, white may actually lose a pawn, but as we may know, or if not, you will know now, the bishop pair does compensate for a single pawn loss. Even if you're down a pawn, but your opponent doesn't have the bishop pair and you do, that gives you compensation. Now you might be asking, okay, whatever. What if I do go d6? I hope you guys like Greek dishes.
That's why I wonder why f5 wouldn't have been his next move instead of d6.
We'll get there in a moment, but first, d6. How can we punish this insolence by black?
Bishop to h7.
Takes, king takes,
Knight.
g5, check. Now, of course, yes, that's correct. This is the classical Greek gift. And now you can see the point of having this pawn push and having the knight on f3. You have all that's necessary for a successful attack. Now, if the king goes to g6, queen c2, I do go pawn to f5.
Queen to g4. Or it could be h4.
So in these type of positions, it's very important you take advantage of the fact that you can force your opponent's hand. Queen g4 is nice, but you can be more forceful.
h4.
h4 is very good, yes. Because h5 is coming, and once the king moves, you have knight takes e6. Even if they try to move anywhere, h5 check, and knight e6. Very good. All that said, probably queen g4 is strong too, although you have to contend with f5 then. But h4 clearly is a great move here. Now, you can try go f5, but the difference is my knight is not in an awful spot. And in fact, white is for choice here. White can decide A, to capture, to open it up for the bishops, or you could just go for d5 pawn push and just gain even more space. Now, e takes is not an option because white would have just too many pawns in the middle already in black's camp. This is, from a strategical perspective, of one position. But back to the game. Black, of course, understood this and decides to play it differently. Now, with this pawn on d6, this idea of knight f3 no longer works as well. So he continues with the normal plan, but sort of forced black to play a slightly inaccurate move. And this is the time where both sides had like a little bit of a hiccup, and the big question is, who made the bigger inaccuracy? e5, castle, rook e8. Okay, so in general, the big dilemma in these kind of positions, if white can keep the tension before the position becomes too closed. So let's say d5, an issue here is that you kind of locked in your own bishop. Therefore, black becomes quite solid, even though white has a bit of a advantage, space advantage, that is. So how can we try to control the center and gain control of the center without completely closing it down? f3. And what's the idea?
To prevent black from pushing that pawn.
Okay. So apart from pushing that pawn, the upside of f3, you're actually preparing the idea of e4. Now, in these type of positions, I already mentioned, if we lose a pawn, do we care? Pfft, we don't care. Why not? We got the bishop pair. Even if we lose a pawn temporarily and we get it back, the position opens up, and that's what we're looking for. So b6, we don't care, take our pawn. And in fact, Bogdan takes the pawn, and probably he should have tried to keep the position closed and not let the bishop to g5. He takes. Now it's not the end of the world, it's still okay. Now, you get into this pin as black. How would you treat this situation? How would you get out of that pin?
Hate those pins.
Yeah, these pins are painful. I agree.
This seems risky, but h6.
H6 is completely fine. He goes rook e5, but disregard that. Just think for yourself. H6, I go here. Now g5. There's one thing I always talk about, and that's these pawns are guardian pawns. If you move that pawn, it will never go back home, and it's not a true guardian if it goes on vacation. So we don't want to play g5 if possible. If it's a last resort, it's a last resort. That's something you have to deal with. But how else could you break the pin? And it's actually quite important.
Yeah, exactly.
Rook e6. But is the rook on an ideal spot there? No.
Queen e7.
And then where are you going with the queen?
e5.
E5 or maybe e6, right? Because, so one of the things that's important whenever you're dealing with pins is that you don't want to completely misplace a piece, and you want to be able to be flexible. So if you get your queen too close to the center, it's very easy to attack it. So you might want to avoid that. But queen e7, as you said, would have been much better. Just go queen e6, and yeah, white might be a little bit better, but it's not the end of the world. Now black goes rook e5, and this is dangerous business, although I do have to credit Deac that he's trying to fight in the position, even though it's not too familiar for him. However, it's going to backfire because this rook does not belong there. Bishop h4. No, there's no reason to rush f4. Keeping the pin. g5 still would be a bad move, especially as you don't have a dark squared bishop anymore. So queen e7, bishop e2, going after the pawn. Rook a5, rook b3, bishop a6. So Deac is sort of trying to get Fabiano in an unfamiliar territory, but by that plays a risky plan, kind of misplaying and misplacing that rook on a5. Queen takes d4, queen e5. And one big critical question here, do we trade or not? Now we got to be objective. So yes, white does have the bishop pair, but is there anything that's sort of a nuisance in white's position? I mean a weakness, rather. C4 is a weakness, and e3 also needs some defense, right? So in chess, actually, you don't always have to defend your stuff. You can counterattack. So Fabi actually says, I got the bishop pair, which will still be powerful, as you'll see, even without the queens on the board. And most importantly, even if he loses the c pawn, he's got the d pawn to go against. So queen takes, rook takes, knight e8. And again, this knight defends the d6 square, but at what cost? The knight loses all its value, and only value it has is the defense of the pawn. So bishop e1, he chases the rook away. Bishop b4, and now you'll see that this d pawn becomes extremely weak. f4, gaining space. Rook c8, and also setting up some pseudo threats. Rook c3. Now, a key of professional chess, if you have a weakness, over defend it. Make sure there's no way to capture it, or if they do, you'll have something as a compensation in return. Why make sure that c pawn doesn't fall? Rook c7, king f2. Yes. So if they go push the b pawn, white can just take here, and at the end of the day can take on a6. So yes, you take stuff here, but this pawn is going to be much stronger than this one, because once I net that pawn is going to be a monster. And it combined, so let's say here, combined with the threats on the f7 square and the a7 pawn, it's deadly. And you may notice that this knight is worthless compared to our bishop.
And the back rank is also.
The back rank might also be an issue.
Yeah, rook all the way down.
So here, king f2, h5, h3, g6, a4, rook c8. So Chet is asking, when does Fabi come on the show? Well, that's going to happen later. That's going to be during Rapid and Blitz, and that's around August 12 to 16. That's when it's happening. And it's going to be here live in person, to be specific. So rook c8, hopefully. Fingers crossed. So rook c8, king e3, and again, the thing is, white has a king advantage, practically. This king can never really come closer because I have e5. So bishop b7, f5. And this king is officially becoming a warrior king. Takes.
It's becoming like
King
something
f4.
that's a Nigel game.
Yes, that's correct. Although here there are no queens around, so it's very difficult to use as a mating force. Here, black panicked, but it's already kind of too late. Bishop e7. The problem is, after d takes, I do take you, takes, bishop takes, and black is completely dominated. The h-pawn is going to fall, and the game with it. So he goes rook e8, rook e3, and here black resigned. But I want you to find the finishing touches nonetheless if black does take on c4. It's white to move and win the game. Bishop f6. Yep, you can't touch this because the rook is hanging. Rook takes e3.
Yeah.
King h7. And rook h8, checkmate. Very well done. So that is actually the reason why in this position black resigned. So I really hope you enjoyed this lecture on modern day preparation, and thank you so much for coming.